Back once again with the Renegade Master, sharper than sharp, brighter than bright. It is time for Irreverence with me, the Reverend Jamie Franklin, and my good friend, Thomas Pelham. Now, Tom, I just said we were brighter than bright. I didn't really think about that before I said it. That might sound a bit conceited. I meant happy. I didn't mean necessarily
We are happy.
I didn't mean necessarily really clever. And
no, we're not clever. Well, I mean, we try to be as clever as we can be, I guess, but it's not about cleverness.
We try to appear clever, which is different.
Well, you do, I think. I mean, I've got I've got to admit that I'm in your sort of in the presence of such intellectual superiority as Daniel and yourself. I sort of just have to rely on what everyone else needs to rely on, which is good common sense. That's what we need. Good common sense. All you need to refute all this nonsense that's been going on. Good common sense. Humility
is one of the greatest virtues, Tom, and you have that. You have that in abundance, far more than I do. So, congratulations. Congratulations on your level of humility. I was going to start with, because I didn't want to start all the podcast in exactly the same way. Oh, how are you? Or the weather's blah blah blah. The weather is actually really nice here, but let's resist the temptation. What I was going to say, Tom, is we might talk about quite a lot of critical stuff maybe in this episode, but I wanted to ask you, what is making you happy at the moment? And it really can't be the weather. What's making you happy, Tom? What makes you happy in your life? Tell me that.
Do you know what? When you go into my son's room in the morning and he smiles at you, the first thing he does, in the morning, he wakes up crying. You go through, and the first thing you get is this: when he sees who it is, massive smile. Sets off your day in the right way. That's the happiest thing in my life at the moment, I think.
That's great. Just remind me how old your son is.
6 months.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah, our baby, who I think she's about 8 months now. I do really know. I absolutely do know her birthday. She's crawling a lot now, and that's okay. That's very funny. It's more hard work. Have you got to the sitting phase where he just sits? No, yeah, you haven't got that.
Sitting. He is moving around though, but he does it sort of like a backwards caterpillar.
Right.
It's the best I could describe it. Sort of like a kind of like that.
Yeah, like a kind of what's that type of dancing? I'm so out of touch. You know that type of dancing. You know that dancing they do. The young lads where they do. No, that's from the 80s. I mean, like when they do those funny walks and
the Batsumi,
the worm and things like that. It's it's not parkour. That's the thing where they jump from building to building. There's a type of dancing, break dancing. That's it. Yeah. Break.
Do they do that? That's not modern, Jamie. That's been going on since the 80s as well.
I think you'll find it's more modern than the moonwalk, which Michael Jackson got from like a silent comedian, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong about that.
I don't know, Jamie. I don't know. Although this reminds me of I've been watching some really good films, and I watched Forrest Gump for the first time quite recently, and it shouldn't have been the first time. Yeah, I know. So that was a great choice.
94.
And
did it win Best Picture in 94, or was it one of the other?
I just don't know.
I know that Shawshank Redemption, Pulp Fiction, and I think Four Weddings and a Funeral were all nominated for Best Film at the Oscars that year, 94.
In any case, that's a good year then. I saw it, and I'm reminded of the Elvis Presley dance. The sort of the implication being that he learnt it off of the young Forrest Gump and trying to dance in his crutches. A rather touching moment. Where you sort of. You think he's being mocked, and then you realise that actually there's sort of something gentle going on there. Yeah. Anyway,
it's a very moving film, and with a youthful looking Tom Hanks, who is very good. I can't remember though. Sorry, I'm just switching my phone off so it doesn't disturb us while we're talking. I can't remember which film won Best Film in 94. It's like it's a specialist subject for me. As you can see, I know all the films from 94. I don't know why, I just memorized them all. But have you seen Shawshank?
Of course I've seen Shawshank, yes.
Yeah, you like that one?
I did like that one.
Yeah, good. And do you say films, you've seen some films plural? Have you seen any others?
Yeah, I did. I think I talked about it with you last time I was here. I saw Remember the Giants.
Oh, no, I don't think you did talk about that.
Which is a great film, and I've seen Crimson Tide. No, I have talked about it on here.
You talked about
the same major actor. Yeah. So
okay. Yeah.
since then, it's been beach weather here, so we've been trying to go to the beach, which has been nice. And I had a family wedding, which was a great joy.
Yeah.
Great joy, which was up in Nottingham, so not far from you, Jamie. Unfortunately, didn't have time because there were so many people to see, things to do. Couldn't pop in, but it was just fantastic to be celebrating marriage again.
Yeah, I wasn't here anyway. I don't think, Tom. I think I was on my holiday in
Yeah.
my islands, having some great times on the beach and swimming and everything. Yeah, it was nice actually. It was nice to be outdoors. It was nice to go swimming in the sea. It's kind of I don't really know how to describe it. It's just a sort of an experience that takes you out of yourself, especially when it's very, very cold. So it was good, man. I had a good time, and I'm feeling quite relaxed actually. I mean, I might get worked up as we continue.
I'm sure we will.
I feel very relaxed at the moment. I'm pleased you've been watching some decent films, Tom. I mean, Forrest Gump, is it a bit cliched? Is it a bit like,
Do you know what? Maybe
it's not really the coolest film, is it? I mean,
but it's very nice. It's a very nice film, and it's a great bit of acting. And
yeah.
I don't know, Jamie. I don't worry too much about these things. I just live for the moment.
Who cares? As long as you enjoy it. I'm fed up with all this pretension, Tom. I know we've touched on this before, but I like things that I like, okay, and I don't care what people think. I really like Downton Abbey. I'm sorry if you think that's not cool. I'm sorry if people think, oh, Jamie likes Downton Abbey. Oh, isn't he a bit tame? Isn't he a bit soft? No, I like it. I find it comforting, and I like the house. And I've watched it all the way through twice, including the film, which I do acknowledge is rubbish. And I'm watching it for a third time because I genuinely find it very, very relaxing and pleasurable.
Fair enough.
And if anyone's got a problem with that, I don't care.
I mean, it's not something I've ever watched or intend to watch, Jamie, but to each his own. To each his own.
I just say one thing, Tom, before we move on, that you're missing out. If you've never watched Downton Abbey, it is a classic. It's a classic, Tom.
But these days, I've sort of been not really at my computer or at the television very much. I've been spending time building model ships and playing with model figures, and at our local, as we spoke a couple of weeks ago, at our local
Games Workshop.
Well, it's not a Games Workshop actually. It's just a local game store, and it's been great fun meeting people, doing things together, learning new things.
I hope they're not violent things, Tom.
They're not. Well, obviously not violent things. It's like chess. It's quite abstract.
Okay, that's good.
I mean, you could think of chess as violent if you wanted to, couldn't you?
It's very violent. Yeah. So, Tom, I've been away. Tell me what's been. Yep. I haven't been watching the news or anything, obviously, because it would have spoiled my time away. But what's been going on? Tell me some stuff.
Well, I mean, to be honest, to a degree, Jim, we're sort of locked in this will they, won't they loop. It's like being at a pantomime, he's behind you.
It's like being in Friends.
Yeah.
For like the entire thing where, will they, won't they?
Yeah, exactly. Are they going to delay our freedom or not? And, one day that you get a sort of, Witty and Valence coming in with doom-laden predictions, and the next day you have Prime Minister's spokesman saying there's no indication that they're going to have to stop it. The surprising little stage entry from the NHS boss today, which is saying, the NHS isn't going to be overwhelmed. That's nice to hear.
Simon Stevens.
Yeah. But it's still will they, won't they? On the other hand, obviously Sage are going wild with the idea that that we might actually regain, some of the freedoms that have been seized from us. I mean, to be honest, you can't really stay on tenterhooks for any longer, can you? I mean, part of me strongly suspects that we're going to see a delay in the roadmap for no particular reason. They want to delay for 2 weeks. You think, well, what on earth is the point in delaying for 2 weeks?
Yeah. Well, nobody is dying anymore, are they? So I think that's what people are saying. They're saying, what further criteria could there be for releasing the lockdown? I mean, you could have people come back to life. You could have some resurrections, but short of that, it's hard to know. No one's dying. It's hard really to know, isn't it? What else do they want?
What do they want? I mean, they want variants to go away, but unfortunately, that's not biologically plausible. And as we've said before, like if we are going to spend the rest of our lives chasing variants, then we will never get out of lockdown, and we will never be free again. it's just, it's impossible for the vaccines to chase variants. The variant has to come into being in order for the vaccine to be developed for it. It's always going to be months down the line. So, and there's this great video with on talk radio of Julia Hart-Bentley?
Julia Hartley-Brewer.
Julia Hartley-Brewer. Do you know what, Jamie? And it's probably become very obvious to listen.
You're getting her mixed up with David Bentley Hart, the theologian.
Bentley Hart. Yeah, I do. For some reason, my names I'm very bad with names and places. It's been noted. But yes, she gave this wonderful interview. It's incredible interview with a chap who used to be an MP and is a doctor, and his basic message was, we can never unlock. Never unlock. We can't unlock.
He said we can't unlock until everyone's been vaccinated, didn't he? And she involved him in a loop. I did actually hear this, where she said, right, so what are you saying about people getting vaccinated? He said, everyone needs to be vaccinated. And then she said, well, what about the people who don't want to be vaccinated? And he said, well, we need to force them, but we can't force them. And then she said, well, in the absence of them having the vaccine, then what do we do? And he said, just stay in lockdown. Yeah. So it's essentially, like we can't come out of lockdown unless everyone's been vaccinated, but we can't force people to be vaccinated, and we know some people won't be. So basically, the logical implication of that is being in lockdown forever.
It's madness. It's just, and you've got to think that people like him are actually, consider themselves to be sensible, and also are alarmingly close to the positions of power. I mean, like I say, he has been an advisor and an MP, as I understand it. So it's weird, and I think it's an indication. Maybe we need to talk about it with Laura later. Have we mentioned we're going to speak to Laura later?
No, and in fact, people probably switched off already because they've seen Daniel's not here, and they're just thinking, I'm not listening to this with Tom and Jamie just going on and on and on. Even though we founded this podcast and Daniel joined subsequently, and we love having him, we would never want him to not be part of it. But just remember who the founders are. But in about 45 minutes, we have the one and only Laura Dodsworth coming to join us, which I'm very excited about, and also a little bit nervous actually, because
it's a big name, biggest name we've had on the podcast. I mean,
let's not denigrate other guests, right?
Okay, no, that's fair.
She is the woman of the moment. She's the person of the moment, because she's written this fantastic book, A State of Fear: How the UK government weaponized fear during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a fantastic book. I finished it yesterday. The only reason it took me so long to read it is because I couldn't get hold of it, because it was selling so well. It was really hard to get hold of.
I believe that Daniel obviously negotiated with the publishers to send us a copy, didn't he? I think, because
I'd already bought 2 copies by that point, so it was a bit of a.
So I got back from my holiday to find it waiting on the doorstep, which is a great surprise, and it's an incredible read. But we'll talk about it later. I think we'll get there. So very excited about that. Very sorry not to have Daniel here, but we can cope. I think, Jamie, that there's that
Well, we started the podcast, so we wouldn't have been able to start the podcast if we couldn't cope with just you and me chatting.
I know.
I mean, to be honest, the thing with me isn't about filling content with you, Tom. It's about trying to sort of get you to minimize the content, because there's just so much in your brain. And there's no sort of like filter, is there? Anyway, just let's go back for a minute. It's all banter, by the way.
It's all banter. So other things going on this week. Yeah, that's what we want to do.
No. Do you want to carry on with this thing about vaccines, or do you want to talk about sport? Because I know
I think vaccines we need to talk about them. They need to have a slot, because we're going to talk. We've had some interesting correspondence today, this very day. Yeah. So we'll talk about that as a slot in a bit, because I just want to talk a little bit about a non-COVID matter, well, sort of non-COVID matter. It's two of these 3 items are non-COVID, but they're all related.
It's all related, though, isn't it?
By sport. So with an honourable mention to the third, the first thing I need to talk about is the British the English national football team, and the furore about the booing during taking the knee. Now, there's been a lot of toing and froing about this, but effectively, as we know, taking the knee is not just a sort of politically neutral act of affirmation of black people. It's not, and to pretend that it is to be willfully ignorant of the context.
It's either disingenuous or naive, isn't it? It's you're either ignoring the obvious origin of where the gesture comes from, or you're just very naive, in my opinion. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, well, you're quite right. And so obviously, taking the knee is a reference to George Floyd's murder, as it's been found in the USA, unlawful killing, it began as an act of solidarity towards that situation, but has been, I think, swiftly took on the sort of Black Lives Matter sort of mantra, and Black Lives Matter are not just a group that are saying, well, they're not just saying, Black Lives Matter. They're saying a whole host of other things about race, about the solution to problems of racism in society. And taking the knee is affirming their political sort of system, should we say? Which with all the things they go. So they're very Marxist. They're anti-democratic. They're anti-capitalist. They
want to defund the police.
They want to defund the police. All these things. That is what taking the knee is. And if you take the knee, you're taking the knee to all. You're showing acceptance of all those things. There are other ways of promoting racial justice in football, where we obviously racism anywhere is absurd and wrong. And does need to be, especially when it's violent or being encouraged, needs to be firmly repudiated, rejected. But I mean, one thing that one of the spiked commentators pointed out, Millwall booed the taking of the knee, but they cheered when the footballers held up a banner the next week promoting black players. So it's not, these football crowds are not racist ignoramuses. They are simply not prepared to enter into the wider issues around the wider BLM movement, and so pretending they're just racist is wrong, and frankly, taking the knee is wrong. This is a context that's 2,000 miles away, talking about very different issues in society to the ones we have here, where our own government's recent paper on racism found that actually, whilst there are obviously racist issues, because there always will be to a degree, people will always be ignorant. People are always fallen. We're never going to reach utopia. But except of course in the next world, but the issue is that actually we're not particularly a racist society, and the sort of structural inequalities that we see in America are not seen here to the same degree.
I think also, Tom, there's, even leaving the kind of empirical question aside of whether or not we're a racist society, and I would say in general that we're probably one of the least racist societies that there's ever been. But even leaving that aside, I think that for the majority of a couple of things. For the majority of football, so the largest demographic that's into football, probably that goes to the grounds, are white working class English men and boys, and I think they look at the gesture, the BLM gesture, and they see it as something which is bourgeois, which is American, which is inauthentic. So I think there's something there about that, that they find that, and the fact that these football players have played, they pay millions of pounds a year to play football, and this is a gesture that costs them absolutely nothing. In fact, in some ways, they think they're going to get prestige from doing it. And what are they actually doing about any, ameliorating any social conditions? It's a complete empty virtue.
Empty gesture, virtue,
in religious language, you would call it a pharisaical gesture. So there's that, and I think football fans are, like we've talked about many times on this podcast, the working class are actually very smart and very switched on. They're very streetwise, and they can smell this kind of thing when it happens, and they don't like it, and so they're booing it. Yeah. And so for Gareth Southgate and people to be saying, oh well, we're just going to double down on it because this confirms to us that we need to keep on making this stand. Actually, I think it's tin-eared, and I think they should listen to the fans.
Yeah.
And they should do a different gesture, which the fans can get on board with. They did a different gesture, the fans would get on board with it.
Well, as I said, Millwall did a different gesture. The fans got on board with it. It's just let's. It feels an awful lot like sort of snobbery against the working classes, and I think it is coming from some very privileged people indeed.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd say about it, Tom, as a football fan, I just find this kind of thing so annoying, because I don't care to see this in football, right? Football is not about politics. It's meant to be something which helps you to relax, helps you to escape from these kinds of concerns. And football is becoming increasingly politicized. Podcasts about football, some of the podcasts I listen to, the Guardian football podcast, for example, and there are others as well. Some of them devote whole episodes. The BBC does this. They devote whole episodes to racism in football. And I'm sorry, but that's just not why people listen to football podcasts. They listen to them and they watch football because they like football, not because they want to hear all about the problems with the FA and racism. It's not directly relevant for most football fans. They just like football, as crazy and as unreasonable as that would seem. And then the other thing about this is it's so hypocritical as well, because in football, in the English Premier League with the FA, and as far as I'm aware, this is true in other leagues in Europe, for example, political gestures are banned. They're still officially banned as far as I'm aware. So Pep Guardiola, for example, he was wearing a yellow ribbon, which I believe was to do with his support of Catalonian independence. And he got in all sorts of trouble for wearing this tiny little yellow ribbon. There have also historically been furores over players should they wear poppies or not, because poppies are seen as potentially political gestures, right? Because some people are anti-war and they think the wars were wrong, and they think we should wear poppies. So this is political. This is a contested issue, and therefore it's not appropriate to be talking about these things or visualizing them or whatever in a football match, because football is about football. It's not about politics. And I think that's right. I think that's the way it should be. I don't think there should be political gestures. I mean, you might say the thing about Guardiola, maybe that's taking it a bit too far. It was a tiny little yellow ribbon. He's not on the pitch. He's on the sideline. Maybe that's taking too far. I don't know. But even so, that is in place, right? So now, as of last year, you've got football players with the words Black Lives Matter written on their shirts, replacing their surname, right? You've got Black Lives Matter written all over stadiums, huge letters with the fans not present. They put these canvases on the seats, Black Lives Matter, enormous letters, people taking the knee and so on. Now, as you said, Tom, this organisation, whatever else it is a political organisation. Of course, they're anti-racist, and everyone would say on a superficial level we're against racism. I think the anti-racism thing is an ideology as well, which is more than just about not being racist. But let's say we agree that racism is a bad thing, generally speaking. But then there are all these other political issues as well, which you've already touched on. The dismantling of the nuclear family and of heteronormativity, and the defunding of the police, for example. These are explicitly political things, and they've got no place in football. So we shouldn't be having these gestures. It's hypocritical, and it's wrong, and it's distracting, and all it does is just make football miserable, to be honest with you. And lots of people now, they just don't want to watch it because they're sick of this. It's just this is seriously the way I feel about football is it's one thing in life that you can just as a Spurs fan, I'm not sure that this is actually true, but it's one thing in life you're supposed to just be able to enjoy. It's supposed to just be fun. Does everything have to be politicized now? So I know I'm going a bit of a rant. Other sports stuff.
Other sports stuff. Cricket is the next one that I really want to turn the eye on. Ollie Robinson is an up and coming bat and bowler, and bat and ball man. He's an all rounder. He's very talented. He's young, and 10 years ago he typed some very silly things into Twitter, and because of that, despite his now apology. This is, of course, 10 years ago. It was before he was professional, I suspect.
He was 18.
Still at school, yeah. And because of this, he has been banned from playing international cricket. Now, I just the thing that gets me about this, Jamie, is it's sort of we have walked from a sort of Christianized. The whole point of what Christianity says about humankind is that humankind fails, with the exception of one member, which is Christ. Humankind fails to live up to the potential of what it should be. It falls short of that all the time, and every one of us, therefore, is a sinful person. That is an essential truth about Christianity, and it's a realistic way of looking at the world, because if you don't look at the world that way, you end up where we are now, which is that unless you are absolutely perfect, at least your imperfections haven't been exposed, which I think is the key thing here, you are completely you are unable to pursue public life. And Ollie Robinson wrote something silly on Twitter, and it's not, it is fairly silly. I think possibly we're in slightly different times then, but I think everyone should have known that was a silly thing to write, but is now being punished for it without really having any recourse to no way of being absolved. Because there's no absolution anymore. There's no, you can't. Your sins have to be paid for, and Ollie Robinson's punishment is to be stopped playing the game that he is good at, is making money, successfully out of, is a passionate player of. Whose past could really stand up to minute, examination in this sort of way? Whose past could, Twitter is roughly the equivalent of mouthing off in the pub. Who hasn't said stupid things in the pub?
Yeah. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquity, O Lord, who could stand? I think that's in the Psalms, isn't it? I forget what Psalm it is. Yeah. I mean, it's a really good point, Tom, because I'm sure we've said this on the show before, but this sort of identity politics thing, it really wants to divide the world into groups of good people and bad people. And you can move over from the good group to the bad group very, very easily. And as you say, it can be on the basis of something you did a really long time ago, which doesn't actually represent who you are now at all, really. And the Christian claim is not that there are good people and the bad people, but it's that, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, that the line between good and evil runs along or runs through the middle of every human heart. That we're a mixture of good and bad. We're fundamentally fallen because of sin, but the image of God still resides in us to some degree. And all of us need to be redeemed by Christ. And I think this is, for me, I was saying that thing about the anti-racism thing being a kind of ideological thing. This for me is the difference between the identitarian narrative that we're living with now and the kind of thing that was represented by Martin Luther King and those civil rights activists in the 1960s. Martin Luther King was a Christian, and he believed that all human beings needed to be redeemed from sin, and he believed that the only way to bring about peace and reconciliation was through the gospel and through forgiveness. So it's an extremely powerful sermon on forgiveness that I read in a book, Penguin Classics, A Gift of Love, which is a collection of his sermons. Every act of true forgiveness is a genuine surrender to the will of God, something that he wrote in that sermon, that as we forgive one another, we can only do that through submitting our will to God. And it's only forgiveness that can bring about true reconciliation and harmony. And that was really the underpinning of his vision for a post-racial future where white and black children play together. This identitarian narrative is totally different. It's in my view, it's a reversal of what Martin Luther King was doing, because what he was saying is we need to have a fair society where people are treated equally. What these people are saying is that we need to have a situation where everybody has the same outcome, essentially. And in order to make that outcome happen, we need to manipulate people's situations and privileges and opportunities in such ways to bring that about. It's a completely different thing to Luther King. And as you say, there's this kind of very, very rigid and legalistic understanding of the original sin of racism, which is why white people are guilty of it in this narrative. It's not black people are not guilty of it. White people are guilty of it. And so it's a very sort of simplistic, rigid, legalistic view of the relationship between, well, of humanity and also of the relationship between the races as well. It's unforgiving, and there's no grace in it. And once again, to see it sort of infiltrating sport is just, well, it's just tiresome. I'm not a cricket man myself, Tom. I don't know whether you are, but
I do enjoy cricket. I don't really. I'd love to learn to play it.
You'd be a really good bowler because of your height, wouldn't you?
So I have bowled a little bit. It's a little bit erratic, must be said, because it's not an obvious way of controlling where a ball goes, lobbing it above your head like that. But
yeah. You know, Tom, I think we've got a little bit of time before Laura comes. I think we should move on and talk about this this Humanist Christian Alliance, shouldn't we? Should we do that?
Yeah, well, should we have a scripture of a week first?
Totally forgot about that. Yeah. So this is really relating to. I was thinking about this. Actually, someone sent this to me as a basis of, as a result of a conversation about Laura's book. But from John chapter 8. So thinking back to psychological operations, which we're going to be talking about in a bit. So I'll just read a bit here. So it's talking Jesus having confrontation with the Jews who oppose him. He said to the Jews who had believed in him, oh, sorry, I got that wrong. He's having a conversation with the Jews who believe in him, not the ones who oppose him. Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, if you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And he goes on to say, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not continue in the house forever. The son continues forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. And then a little bit later on, contrasting the freedom that Christ brings, he talks to the Jews who are accusing him of being a devil. He says to them, you are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and has nothing to do with the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So within that passage in John chapter 8, you've got that contrast between Jesus Christ, who speaks the truth to us, and he speaks the truth to us in order to free us from bondage and slavery, which is ultimately caused by sin. So he speaks the truth to us, and he gives us the choice, if you like, to listen to the truth, to live in the truth, and to be set free by the truth. And you contrast that with the devil and what the devil does. He's a murderer from the beginning. He has nothing to do with the truth. He speaks lies which are according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So the devil speaks lies to us in order to deceive us, in order to manipulate us, and ultimately in order to control us and to take away our freedom. Now, I don't want to draw too direct a parallel between the devil and the government or whatever, but I think that one of the things which comes across so clearly to me in Laura's book is the way that psychological operations, psyops, are all about the way that all about trying to get you to think and feel in a certain way without even actually noticing it. So you feel afraid, and then because you feel afraid, you will comply with what you're being told to do. But actually, a lot of the time that you're made to feel afraid it's on the basis of a lie. And this is something I will explore with Laura when she comes on. But that's a really important point, is that reading through the book, it's like there's no sense that these people are interested in telling the truth to the population. What they're doing is they're thinking, well, what is the behavior we want? And then what do we need to tell people in order to get that outcome? And invariably, this results in half-truths and outright lies. And so in a sense, and I want people to hear this, that this is a heavily qualified sense. I'm not just doing this in a kind of rhetorically flamboyant way, but scripture tells us that when people treat us like that, when they lie to us in order to control us, that's actually diabolical, because it's the way that the devil operates. The way that Christ operates is different. It's the opposite. He tells us the truth, and he tells us the truth in order to make us free. So I think that there's a really interesting scriptural take there, an implicit scriptural take on psychological operations, on psyops, which is that they are actually they're deeply wrong from a spiritual perspective, because they are basically lies to bring about fear, which mean that ultimately you'll be enslaved and controlled. So yeah, so that was my reflection, Tom.
Yeah, and very good, Jamie. And we sort of touched upon this last week as well, 2 weeks ago rather, when we talked about how God abhors falsehood. And I think you know, just comes to mind a few of the advertising campaigns that have come really close to outright lies, even if, you know, things like, you know, the sort of the ones that implied that a third of people were asymptomatically infectious, and, you know, it's simply not ever been shown to be true. Or the ones where you know, the COVID, everyone is at risk from COVID, again, simply not shown to be true. It's, you know, a government lying to its people in order to instill fear is deeply ethically problematic, and we will talk about this, I'm sure, with Laura later, because she has loads of really good examples of where it's coming. You know, we can commend her book because it's quite shocking to the depth to which this has happened. Really, you know, I knew that some of it was happening. It was obvious that some of it was happening, but I hadn't realised quite how, you know, how holistic it had been.
Yeah, how embedded in the very sort of core of the government's operations it really is. So that's a bit of the scripture for this week. I think, Tom, we should touch on this story before we talk to Laura. So this is a story, you really do wonder sometimes what's coming next, don't you? This was from June 2nd. So humanists and Christians urge as many as possible to get vaccinated against COVID-19. Humanist and Christian leaders have come together to urge as many people as possible to get vaccinated, etc., etc. The call is by Churches Together in England and the Scottish Church Leaders Forum on behalf of around 60 member churches, and by prominent figures in the UK humanist movement, such as Stephen Fry, Alice Roberts, Richard Dawkins, friend of the church, Sandy Toksvig, Jim Al-Khalili, and Polly Toynbee. And then they've got their statement, and then the churches together have released their own statement, which was put together by Reverend Dr. Paul Goodliff. Now, before reading this, I find this whole thing a bit sort of confusing. I don't really understand why anyone would find it sort of convincing just because humanists are teaming up with Christians. Just seems a little bit odd to me. It sort of does the opposite to me of what it's supposed to do, which is be convincing. But let's leave that aside. I mean, you know, why would I care as a Christian what Richard Dawkins thinks? You know, I mean, you know, literally, why would I care? Or Stephen Fry? I've got no interest in what Stephen Fry thinks about anything, to be honest. Anyway, so just to begin with, so the COVID-19 vaccine churches statement. So I think before we read this, Tom, both of us find this statement to be deeply problematic for all sorts of reasons, and I think one of the things we find really problematic is the existence of such a statement at all, which I think both of us would say we think it's inappropriate for churches to be sort of doling out medical advice as though they're sort of experts on it.
It's simply not the place of the church to do. As far as I can tell, there's no scriptural warrant for medical advice, other than in the I think there are various bits in the Leviticus law which don't apply to us anymore.
Well, I mean, what I would say, Tom, is I think there's a pastoral dimension to health which is really, really important. So I wouldn't want to sort of say that I don't think as a pastor of people I've got anything to say about people's health, because actually I've got quite a lot of things to say, and I think they're really important. I think what's obviously, seeing as I think them, I'd obviously think they're important, but what I think is inappropriate is writing open letters with generalized advice to the entire human race. I just think that is, you know, I just think there's something about that which is just, you know, it's kind of, I don't know.
I think it exceeds the authority of the church. In effect, it exceeds the authority of the church, I would say.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah. Anyway, let's get into it. I think it'll become clear why this is inappropriate. So, as churches and communities of belief, we hold a wide variety of faith convictions and don't always agree about everything. However, we are united in believing that it is essential that as many people as possible are vaccinated against COVID-19. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been devastating to our communities, has led to significant loss of life, and has caused vast disruption to everyone's daily lives. It has impacted communal worship, prayers, weddings, and other rites of passages, sometimes meaning that people have had to put their whole life plans on hold. The toll all this disruption has had on people's mental health represents a growing crisis, as does the number of people falling into poverty. So I think the first thing I want to say there, Tom, is that there's this conflation of the COVID-19 pandemic and the measures, the absolutely catastrophic measures that governments have brought in order to deal with this pandemic, which, as far as I'm concerned, don't even work and have ruined economies, societies, and people's lives. So they speak about it like it's an inevitability.
That's the thing.
I know we've said this before, but if you look at Florida, their life has been normal there for months. This is completely unnecessary. Sorry, carry on with what you're saying.
No, I was going to say not just Florida, but across the world. Well, by now, everyone who listens to this will know we can list those countries, can't we? I mean, Belarus, Sweden, South Dakota, as opposed to North Dakota. Texas, Florida.
Yeah. These places exist. They haven't destroyed their economies. They haven't taken away all their citizens.
And they're not all dead.
They're not all dead. There aren't piles of corpses in the streets. These places are real, and they're getting on with life as normal. So anyway, let's continue. The vaccines authorized by the MHRA are the most significant way in which we can control the pandemic, accompanied by widespread testing and isolation regimes. Again, I don't think that's true. I think that there are other treatments available which have been demonized. There's increasing amounts of evidence about ivermectin and things like that, but this is the official government narrative. The vaccines may have been developed and approved for use at unprecedented speeds and with unprecedented investments in collaboration, but they have nonetheless been through the same rigorous approval processes that would be demanded of any medicine before it is authorized for general use. This includes double-blind randomized control trials and peer review. The evidence from those trials suggests that these vaccines are effective and that the risks from contracting COVID-19 far outweigh any risks associated with some of the vaccines. That this is the case represents a towering scientific achievement. Now, you go.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a number of falsehoods in that. First one is they haven't passed all of the normal checks that medicine needs to would normally pass. They are still in their phase 3 trials, and that's why we have to have emergency authorization to use them. That is not a standard way of authorizing drug use in the United Kingdom. So there's a sort of falsehood there. The second thing, of course, is that there is a problem. I don't know quite how they can make that statement with a straight face when it's been clear, for example, the AstraZeneca vaccine has actually been found to be more dangerous to people than COVID, and the point at which that because of course COVID has an age range disparative risk. The point at which that happens is around about the age 40. So they won't give it to people under the age of 40. This, of course, is the vaccine that our bishops exhorted us all to be taking in that creepy video from 2 months ago. The fact is that things and all of the vaccines, all of the COVID-19 vaccines, have health risks far higher than than vaccines that are in common use.
Yep.
So even if they are less dangerous than catching COVID after a certain age and in certain risk profiles, they are still substantially more dangerous than any other vaccine that's ever been authorized for use on humans. Substantially.
Yeah, and so the thing that I think is really disingenuous about this, Tom, is that we don't know, for example, what long-term effects these vaccines are having on people, because they've been developed within the last 18 months, haven't they? So we can't know the long-term safety data. So that would be the first thing. And then the second thing, and this goes back to this kind of generalized medical advice thing. The second thing is that when you give this kind of generalized medical advice, it's inevitably going to be inaccurate for lots of people. So we know that the risk of dying from COVID is stratified according to age, isn't it? So if you've got, so I've got a list here. This is from a paper that came from Imperial College London. So if you're between the ages of, if you're under 50 years old, let's say, your risk of dying from COVID is 0.24 if you're 45 to 49 years old, and then it decreases as you get younger. So by the time you get to 30 to 34 years old, it's 0.06, and then it goes down and down and down. By the time you're 10 years old, it's 0.01, 0.01 for 5 to 9 years, and then 0.4 years is 0% chance of dying. So if you've got a 0% chance of dying, basically, and the vaccine has any risk associated with it at all, the vaccine is going to be more dangerous for you than taking COVID, than catching COVID. So to say the evidence from those trials suggests that vaccines are effective and that the risk from contracting COVID-19 far outweighs any risks associated with some of these vaccines is really, really misleading. And at the very least, it's very vague. So which age groups is it talking about? That might be true for people who are, say, older than 80. It's certainly not true for people who are younger than 10. And this is another thing that this statement doesn't do. It doesn't address child vaccination. We can only think that when it says, as many people as possible are vaccinated against COVID-19, we can only assume that they're talking about children as well. So
now, I actually questioned him about this, and I got a reply today, and he does say that that he doesn't intend to include children in that statement. But then again, he also puts that judgment back on the NHS. So if the NHS says that children should be vaccinated, then he will support that.
But I think he has to acknowledge that if he writes a paper which says that as many people as possible need to get vaccinated, that category includes children, right? Because he hasn't said as many people as possible over the age of 18. Right? Children are people, aren't they? So you've got to take responsibility for the things.
So this is what he says. He says, we have not spoken about children's vaccination, which is arguably not true. He hasn't mentioned it. Since at the moment there are no policies to do so, if government policies developed to vaccinate children, who you correctly note do not seem to suffer from ill health from COVID-19 infections nor appear to transmit the virus until adolescence, then I assume the churches will argue against such a policy, and CTE might make another statement, this time condemning that policy, if that was a view of our member churches. Well, I assume they won't particularly argue against that policy, because I see no evidence that they have any interest in arguing against any of the government policies to do with COVID-19, regardless of the ethical status of them. But we'll see.
That kind of goes back to this thing about allying with the humanists, doesn't it? If you had a distinctively Christian contribution to make, you wouldn't be able to just ratify what humanists and a secular non-Christian government says. You would have your own distinctive contribution to make, but you don't. So all you do is ratify what you've been handed without any. And this is the thing. I mean, this at the end it makes a very sort of fleeting gesture to Scripture, where it says, "Here is an opportunity to make our contribution to the common good and a practical way to love our neighbours as ourselves." And that's about as deep as it gets theology-wise. From people who take this line, which is that, what the government is saying is good, and then as Christians what we need to do is be loving, so we just need to do what the government says. It's very, very shallow, really.
Very shallow. And I think it goes without saying that that none of the churches have particularly bothered to engage with morality around, for example, the use of aborted stem cell and liver cell kind of material in the production and testing of all of the vaccines that are present at the moment. And none of them have bothered to. They've just whitewashed it. They're happier to ignore it.
I mean, I know of individual priests and pastors who have addressed it, but certainly at a kind of nationwide level, there's been very, very little
other than a whitewash, and it's not good enough, because I mean, you might even say that an awful, that the sin of abortion in the past doesn't necessarily mean that that it's tainted. Although, I mean, I'm not quite sure how you make that argument, but I think the number of Christians have. But you've still got to deal with an ongoing problem, which is how those human remains of those aborted fetuses are being treated, and we have very specific ways of treating and dealing with human remains in the church, which is with respect, as something that will be a part of the resurrection body. It can never be right to take a part of a body, to keep it alive artificially, to multiply it artificially, to then own it and sell it, to maintain it, it's disgusting. It's simply disgusting. It's ethically an ongoing sin. It's not as if this is something that happened 50 years ago and won't happen again. This is an ongoing problem that everyone who blithely ignores it is ignoring and aiding and abetting this ongoing problem.
Yeah, and this is something which the letter just simply doesn't address.
And when I raised it with him, he simply says, well, that's not what churches say, so we're happy to not say it. And I'm thinking, well, that's great, isn't it? You know.
Well, it's not really an answer, is it? Can we just carry on? Sorry, Tom, unless you want to just dig into that any further.
No, that's fine. I mean, yeah, that's fine.
Well, let's just continue with the end of this, right? So as a result, we support the government's encouragement for everyone who's medically able to be vaccinated against COVID-19, take up the offer of the injection, etc., etc. The end of this phase of the pandemic might be in sight. The government hopes to be able to offer all adults an appropriate vaccine by September, but we can only get there and resume our daily lives as they were if we take up this call. Now, I object to this. This may be, apart from what I view as irresponsible advice, this is the bit in the letter I dislike the most, because this is essentially blackmail. This is saying, well, the government have taken away our freedom, and the only way that we can get it back is by having a vaccination. That's unethical, right? That's blackmail. That's coercion, and that violates the principle of informed consent, because you can only consent to a treatment on the basis of whether or not it will do you good medically. You can't consent to it if you're being coerced and blackmailed. So that's now, let's say he hasn't done that on purpose, right? He hasn't written down something which is coercive on purpose. But that's basically what it is, and that's this letter should be withdrawn for that reason. It's profoundly irresponsible, in my opinion, to basically tell people that they're going to have their freedoms taken away unless they take a vaccine. They should take the vaccine on the basis that the vaccine will protect them from the virus, if they believe that, and that the virus poses a greater risk to them than the vaccine, and a significant risk at that. Not because a church leader has told them that the government are going to continue to restrict their freedom and let them take it.
And again, when I put this to him, he gave a very odd response. And I think there's a certain amount of coercion whenever a church weighs in on something, because when you speak as a church, or as someone with authority of the church, you're speaking with God-given authority, yeah. And there's a problem unless you're aware of that. If you're recommending people do things, you have to be very careful. Because the implication is, of course, that the church says this is the right thing to do. If you don't do it, that's sinful, or it's morally improper, or etc., etc. That's always in the background of a pronouncement from a church. It has to be.
Yeah.
So there is, just saying these things is a level of coercion. We think you should do this. Now, there's when power imbalances like that exist, you have to be very careful. There's a whole area of safeguarding about spiritual abuse, and I'm not saying this is spiritual abuse, but there are similarities here between someone saying you must if anyone's saying you must do anything, or I recommend strongly that you do something as a church, as a Christian, with the authority of God behind me, then you've got to be very careful. You've got to be very careful. That's as far as I'm going to go. But the second problem is that buying into the governmental coercion is buying in and supporting the fear, propaganda, and the messaging of the government uncritically. You're becoming just another part of that same process, in effect. And we know that the government is already holding lockdowns over people's heads as a way of getting them vaccinated, because we've seen the billboards. They can't hide them. The billboards in Manchester, in Burnley, get vaccinated to avoid a second local lockdown. They're there. That's the message. So it's incredibly naive to say that the government aren't using this, which he tries to claim. In his reply to me, the government aren't being coercive because they're not requiring people to do it. it's incredibly naive.
Well, it's like Tony Blair was on the Andrew Marr show, which in an interview which I hope will become notorious in the future. And he was basically saying we can't mandate it, but we can make people's lives as unbearable as possible until they have it, which is basically a form of mandating it, isn't it? You're not going to send people to prison, but you're going to lock them in their houses.
It's coercion.
It's morally indistinguishable to do that. Just to say, Tom, it's almost time for Laura to join us, which I'm very, very excited about. I did actually write a blog on the ethics of the COVID-19 vaccine thingy, and if anyone wants to read it, you can just find my blog at jamiefranklin.wordpress.com, and I'll share it on the show notes as well. But it's called Ethical Considerations Concerning COVID-19 Vaccinations, and I like to think it's a slightly deeper engagement with this issue. I mean, one thing I will say, just while we're waiting for Laura to join us, is that we know people have died after taking the vaccine. And the example I use is Lisa Shaw, who was a 44-year-old mother of one, who died after having the AstraZeneca vaccine. She worked for BBC Radio Newcastle. And she was at very little risk from COVID. If she was a typical 44-year-old, she would have been at 0.16% of chance of dying if she'd contracted COVID. So she took a vaccine which killed her, and she basically had no chance of dying from COVID. Now you have to ask yourself, was it an ethical thing to do for the government or anyone to tell somebody like that to have a vaccine which killed her? Is that really a good way of loving your neighbour, or should we perhaps be a little bit more nuanced about this? But Tom, I don't know whether you can see it from your angle, but Laura Dodsworth is in the waiting room now, which is so exciting. Shall we admit her right now?
Let's do that.
Let's do it right now. Here we go. We are now hoping that Laura will join us. Hello, Laura. Hello, Laura. Can you hear us?
Hello. Hi. I can now. Yes. Hello.
Oh, fantastic. Hello. Nice to see you.
Very nice to see you too.
Well, it's so good to have you on, Laura. Just to introduce ourselves, I'm Jamie, and the man he's on my left, but I don't know where he is on your screen.
Tom.
He's Tom.
There he is. He's there. Yeah. Hi, Tom.
Hello. Well, lovely to meet you, Laura. I really enjoyed is probably not quite the right word, but it was an enjoyable text to read. So thank you. I've enjoyed the book that Daniel arranged to have sent to my door. I'd been on holiday, came home to find it on my doorstep, so I picked it up, and it was a real thriller actually. So thank you for writing that. And
a thriller.
Yeah. It was a page turner. We were exchanging notes over our irreverent what do you call it, signal group.
Yeah.
And,
for top privacy. Laura, I'd already I found it really hard to get hold of the book when we first heard about it. I couldn't find it on Amazon or anywhere, and I was waiting for absolutely ages, and by the time you very kindly offered to send us a copy, I'd already ordered two, so I couldn't take you up on that offer. But I'm assuming that the book is selling really well, and I've heard from loads of people that they're finding it really hard to get hold of. And is that the reason why?
Yeah, it has. It's sold out 3 times now, which is amazing. And I think it will stay in stock now. But the first level of interest took the publisher by surprise, but it also took Amazon by surprise because they hadn't ordered in enough copies, which is something that's beyond the publisher's control.
Yeah.
Demand's been really good. Mind you, the nice thing about Amazon selling out was that it ended up diverting people to independent bookshops, which is quite good. Yeah.
I eventually bought mine from Hive, which I think is a website that actually gives donations to independent bookshops when you buy. So so it's a good thing really overall, but I mean that's interesting, isn't it, Laura, that they underestimated the appetite for a book like this. I mean, I'm not saying we're on the same sort of level as you with your fantastic book, but we've been surprised at how many people have been really interested in our podcast and email us all the time, and we get the sense from what we're doing in a small way that there's a huge appetite out there. People really want to know what's going on. They feel that they're not really being told the truth about what's going on with the COVID narrative and everything, and they're really quite hungry to hear something other than just the endless propaganda and the same monotonous narrative. So this has got to be a great sign, hasn't it, that there are loads of people out there who really want to engage with an alternative viewpoint?
Well, I think so. I think diversity of viewpoints is brilliant. I mean, when I came across you guys, I was excited. I'm not. Yeah, no, really, I'm not. I'm not Christian, but I have my own faith, and I've been kind of waiting for the church to do a bit more on this.
Yeah.
And your name is genius as well, isn't it? Irreverent.
Well, Tom,
because I love a bit of irreverence and a bit of reverence, so both together is just perfect. I think there is a real appetite, and I have a lot of faith in people. I have a lot of faith in us, and ultimately people want truth. Stories can be comforting and stories can be fun, and I have had this sense for the last year that we're living through a big story. And to be honest, the big stories are the stories of good and evil and light and dark and hardship and overcoming and triumph. These are the good stories, but they're not always comfortable to live through. So although some people like living in a story, we do all want truth. People don't want to be hoodwinked. They don't want to be manipulated. And they will ultimately seek humanity, companionship, conviviality, truth, and love, and all of these things. And I suspect that what I'm experiencing with the book and what you're experiencing with your podcast is the same thing. People who want the values that we should treasure as human beings.
One thing that I think is really quite interesting when you're saying that is that one thing that I find very uncomfortable moving in society is that it feels like my narrative of the pandemic is inverted from everyone else's, where it's almost as if I see the lockdown as the enemy, not the virus, and the sort of in a sense, I see viruses are bad, but I don't, I see that more pernicious is what humanity does to humanity. And it's quite uncomfortable when you come across people whose the assumption is that the sort of the big sort of stories are of humanity kind of successfully hunkering down together against the fierce onslaught of the virus, and you get that in that narrative being spun. We were just talking about one part of the church's response to this, sort of their narrative is this: the godly thing to do is to lock down, to protect people, to sacrifice our economy and our time and our freedom. And I'm thinking, this is sitting really strangely with me, uncomfortably. Have you experienced that at all?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I suppose there's been a lot of very martial language throughout. Boris Johnson tried to channel Churchill a number of times, and other world leaders referred to how we're at war or in a battle, or we're in a war we're at war with viruses. Of course, you cannot really be at a war with a virus. Viruses are part of our genome. We've always lived with them, and they're evolutionary successes. But does it make sense in a battle to go to siege? Well, it might do, but this did feel strange to me. There's been a whole narrative about heroes and COVIDiots, and the hero is the one who stays at home and just follows the rules and does what they're told. And there's something about it that prickled against my moral compass too. And I think it's been a story that's been easily sold to people because we see money as bad, capitalism as bad. Actually, capitalism's not lost out at all here. There's been a huge upshift in wealth. As we're quantitative easing and putting money into the economy, it's all trickling upwards towards the richest. They're not losing out at all, but there's this idea that you should put lives before the economy, but it's all the same thing. The economy isn't a separate thing. For me as a single parent, the idea that I wasn't supposed to go out to work and earn money was really shocking. How can that be a good thing, to tell healthy people to stay in their home and not to go out to work and earn a living for their family? And I can understand how people thought that was a sensible temporary measure. To be honest, I didn't ever think it was a sensible temporary measure. But I can see how other people did. But it's now not temporary. We've been in the same situation one way or another for many months. And I think laying waste to people's businesses and jobs isn't just about putting a set of morals above the economy. That's people's lives, their livelihoods are their lives. Yeah. And being industrious and caring about your work and even being ambitious, they're good things. Yeah. I mean, and that's just one aspect of lockdown. Some of it I have found so difficult, I almost can't bear to think about it. When I think about prisoners in their cells for 23 hours a day, it's so uncomfortable. Yeah. Or people with learning disabilities in homes, or old people in care homes and cut off from contact. I think that's fine if that's somebody's choice, but for that to be imposed upon everybody seemed to me to be cruel and immoral, and a virtuous shield around what is essentially people's own fear of death.
Yeah, it's wonderfully articulated, Laura. And I'd like to a little bit later talk about a little bit more about the church's response, because I'd like to hear your view. I think we should ask you though, if you could articulate the sort of central message of this book, because it clearly exists within this world of, you know, an alternative narrative to the mainstream narrative on COVID. The subtitle is How the UK Government Weaponized Fear During the COVID-19 Pandemic. So could you say a little bit about the main thesis and particularly, you know, the stuff to do with psychological operations and all of this thing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a strong subtitle, isn't it? I found it a bit scary, but I thought, well, that's what it's about.
Was it your title and subtitle, Laura, or was it the publisher who gave it to you?
No, it was my title. And to be honest, although my publisher is the one who taught me into doing this book, to writing this book, it's not very writerly, is it, to say doing a book. So although my publisher really encouraged me, when he got the book, he did have a bit of a wobble. He said, oh, it's very polemical. And that's great. We like polemicals, but it is polemical. And we did talk about changing the subtitle. Yeah. But I think that it's quite hard to do a book like this and balance on the fence. So the book is not a refutation of COVID, that it's serious or that it's killed people. It's in no way a tinfoil hat-wearing book. Not at all. It's about our response to COVID. It's about the fear response. It's about how we've all been frightened, because epidemics are frightening times. We are naturally and rightfully afraid of illness and dying. That's just hardwired into us. It's part of our evolutionary success. But it's about how governments do use fear in order to encourage compliance. This is an old story. The UK government's not invented this during COVID. It has most certainly happened before. There are other times when it's done what it said on the tin, if you think about the Reign of Terror or Project Fear. The book is specifically about how the UK government leveraged our fear to make people follow the rules, which there's an argument that is in our best interest, that there's a net benefit for society. I think it's an ethical minefield, and my thesis is that we need a public debate about the use of behavioural psychology, and specifically the use of fear to make people do what they're told, because it comes with enormous collateral damage, and I don't believe it's ethical. And the book explores who did it, how they did it, and what the impacts have been.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think reading the book, so Tom and I discussed this obviously before talking to you. I mean, I think both of us were aware of lots of this stuff. I mean, two episodes back, we did an episode called Psychological Operations. So, I mean, we talked about this kind of stuff before. I think the thing that I found so shocking about this book is how embedded this approach to government is in our government. The various different bodies who are, you know, SPI-B being one of them, probably the most famous, but then many others that you detail in your book, the 77th Brigade and all sorts of other, alphabet soup type things going on there. But it seems in many ways to be the primary sort of tool that the government have in their toolbox in terms of how they're managing this pandemic, and one thinks many other areas of society as well, that they're essentially, what they're doing is they're thinking, you know, these psychologists are thinking, or they're being told this is the outcome, And in order to get to that outcome, we need to say this. And I think the thing that I find problematic about that, I mean, there are many things that are problematic. One of the aspects is that it's hidden, right? And this is a point you make in the books. It's undemocratic to manipulate people without their being aware of it. But the other problem that I have from an ethical perspective is that it puts the question of truth to one side. So it doesn't matter if something's true or not, and it could just be a lie. It could be a total lie, and we'll do it anyway in order to generate some kind of emotion. In this case, we're talking about fear, and then to get compliance. So it's fundamentally dishonest, I would say, the way this has been carried out. And I think, for me, the paradigmatic example that comes across in your book, and I think you indicate this yourself, is the example of masks, which are quite clearly introduced when the pandemic was at a low ebb, in order to primarily to give a signal. And I actually remember, it's interesting the way your sort of treatment of fear is very multivalent, because there is the fear that's been generated by the government in terms of people just buying the narrative, but then there's also another type of fear which perhaps people like us have more readily felt, which is that a fear of, well, what are they going to do next? What are they, how are they going to sort of curtail my life with these pronouncements? And for me, the introduction of masks indoors was a really big one of those, because it generated an awful lot of fear in me, not because of the virus, but because it made me think, well, I don't want to wear a mask to go on a bus or on a tram. I don't want to have to wear a mask if I go into a restaurant. I don't want to have to wear a mask in church. What does this mean for me? And I remember when it was introduced, hearing Boris Johnson on the radio saying the science around masks has grown, and just thinking, that's just a lie. That's a lie. The science around masks hasn't grown. You've just decided that you want to bring in masks in order to keep this thing up. And that's the thing that upsets me so much about this, is that it's deceitful, and the question of truth is no longer something that the government seriously reckon with.
Yeah, gosh, there's so much to pick up on there. Well, I completely agree with you. And I think people have different ideological perspectives. It depends on how you sit with truth. Now, this bothers me, but other people might say that muddying the waters like this a little bit is acceptable if there's a net benefit for society, but it's still not something we've debated as a society. I think it's really difficult to be asked to go along with something that's a lie. And my work has always been about truth, about getting to the truth of things, exploring taboos and thorny issues, and illuminating honesty. And I don't like going along with lies. I found it really hard. And I think it's one of the spines to the book. It's interesting, this hasn't come out in any other interviews before, but I do think that part of the reason I wrote this book is that I can't stand lying.
Right.
I don't want to be lied to, even if it's in my own best interests. It's really the struggle for all of us as humans to work out what's in our best interests. Isn't this the struggle of humanity? What is the good life? And morality is internally determined, as well as coming from the state or church. And I think it's just important to do what's right. So being lied to by our leader and being told the science has changed about masks when it hasn't was difficult to stomach. Yeah. I have to say. And of course, then that plays into your own fears. You said, what would that mean for you if you wear a mask? So I've also considered how aspects of the last year affect me personally. And that's not comfortable, but of course, a lot of fear, there's just so much fear around. There's so much fear in the air. A lot of people want these interventions to continue because they think it will protect them and because they're frightened of the virus. I actually think that the way out of this involves a lot of truth and reconciliation. Yeah. It involves peace and conflict resolution. It involves disaster and recovery. And we only seem to have one side of it at the moment. We don't have the other side. We don't have the truth, the reconciliation, the recovery, and the conflict resolution and the peace. We just have we just have the fear machine going. I don't feel like I've explained that very eloquently, but the problem is how you get people to hold hands across the aisle and understand that everyone has fears of a different sort. I realised early on I was much less frightened of the virus than I was of the manipulation that I could detect. I was very alert to the language, to the statesman's speeches, and to the advertising, which was trying to increase everybody's sense of alarm, even if it wouldn't affect their age category. So instead of just being honest about the messaging, like, well, you know, you teenagers, you're fine, but please, we ask you, don't go to parties and sanitize your hands because you've got a job to do protecting the elderly. Instead of that, it was COVID kills. Anyone can get it, anyone can catch it, anyone can spread it. And that wasn't the truth.
And you would never accept this in any normal human relationship, would you? In a romantic relationship or in a marriage relationship, if one party said to the other one, "Look, I know what's best for you, and so I'm just going to tell you things which may or may not be true in order to do what I think is right," you would never accept that. You would consider that to be abusive. So I would argue that we shouldn't accept it from our government either. I mean, it's you know, at very best it's paternalistic, isn't it? But at worst it's abuse, really. And
yeah, I mean, there've been plenty of other people that have said it in the last year as well. It's like being in a coercive, abusive relationship. You say you wouldn't accept it, but lots of people actually do accept coercion and abuse in relationships, sadly. Yes. I mean, on one hand, it's a bit like having a really strict bad parent who's told you scary stories to make you stay inside. And, you know, you get little rewards and treats for good behaviour, but to be retracted, and you must follow the rules. On the other hand, it's also a bit like being in an abusive relationship with an alcoholic parent or a really nasty partner who just, you know, they just don't tell you the truth and threaten you. Yes. There's one chapter in the book where I have included Biderman's chart of coercion, which is something he devised after talking to prisoners of war who'd been interrogated. And there are lots of comparisons, and that doesn't mean that I don't mean to suggest for a minute that it's like we're prisoners of war or we're being tortured by our government, but there are some eerie parallels in certain tactics.
Am I right? Because one part of your book did you ask the nudge people in the SPIB whether they had sort of had any discussions at all about turning the narrative around, didn't you? And you were, is that right? And you were shocked to find that there was none. The government haven't even thought about how to take us out of this. And it's there, you know, I sort of despair as the press goes back and forth, you know, will we, won't we reopen on the 21st? You know, and you think the government and the population are now trapped in a spiral of dramatic fear, and they can't see any risk in the future. They can't see how what they're in is already risky. Like, we can't stay like this. I mean, what do they think will happen if we just keep pumping money into the economy? What do they think would happen? Seriously. So no one can, so at the same time as everyone acknowledges we can't stay like this, no one's prepared to say, well, even if there are a rise in death and cases, we need to come out of this. We need to stop fearing this. We need to move beyond, because they've all been terrified. And I kind of feel the government listens to its own opinion pollsters who are reflecting the fear that the government have put into the population, and you know, someone needs to start working the other way. I was shocked that they hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah, well, when I interviewed several SPI-B advisors as well as other government advisors. A couple of the SPI-B advisors are named in the book, and a couple needed to remain anonymous. They didn't want to damage their career or their relationship with the government or their reputation. And there were other anonymous sources too. And I asked all of them what the plan was for helping people to climb down out of fear, understanding that our fear had been raised, that alarm levels had been raised. Because if this was a lab experiment, if you agreed to take part in a laboratory experiment with a psychologist to be frightened, there would have to be a plan for how to get you back into a good state at the end. You know, you'll probably involve a slice of chocolate cake and a happy rom-com or something, and you wouldn't be allowed to leave until you're in a good place, at least as good as when you arrived. But that wasn't given any consideration. And that would have been because people were acting in the teeth of the crisis. But it's interesting what happens to thought processes when people are in a panic. So perhaps they rushed into alarming the population to make them follow the rules, to make us all safer, but they didn't think about the exit strategy. And if there were more disaster and recovery specialists advising the government, maybe that wouldn't have happened, because that is a field in itself. And perhaps there should be people who also specialise in conflict resolution and peace negotiations, because what we have now is a very factionalised, polarised country. Yeah. You know, you have people that want lockdown to continue and people who want to burn their masks on the 21st of June. People who want vaccine passports and people who say it's a hill they'll die on. How are we all going to find an accommodation with each other and move forward? And a lot of this is being created by ramping up the fear levels.
Yeah. Laura, what do you think is, I'm not asking you to solve it completely, but what's your inclination? So when you talk about truth and reconciliation, I mean, that obviously invokes the situation in South Africa, when they actually had, you know, truth and reconciliation committees where there could be reconciliation, but only on the basis that the truth was spoken. So there could be no reparation because it would just be impossible. But so what they decided was, well, we'll speak the truth to each other and we'll reconcile with each other, even if, you know, you've done something terrible to me. In that situation, there was a sense in which, broadly speaking, the narrative was agreed upon. This situation is a lot more complicated, isn't it? But I guess, you know, we three talking now, we have, I would say, broadly speaking, you know, skepticism about the narrative, great level of skepticism about the narrative as far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure probably you two as well. But lots of people just buy it, they believe it, and as far as they're concerned, we're the ones who are living in a kind of untruth or a false narrative. So, I mean, do you have any ideas about how that truth and reconciliation, is it that the narrative, the false narrative, is eventually just going to have to break down and people are going to have to accept that this is, you know, this is a government propaganda narrative, which is largely speaking manufactured, or is it that we're going to have to, this is going to be something which will be, you know, debated and dialogued about, and it will be a hugely divisive issue for years and perhaps decades? Do you have any inclination there?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. You're glad you didn't ask me to fix it, because I absolutely can't. I like the idea of truth and reconciliation. I don't have any hope that would happen. The thing is, some absolutely terrible mistakes have happened. I mean, just terrible. Yeah. Old people being transferred from hospitals to care homes. And people were following authority. But, you know, every porter, every doctor, every care home worker, everyone involved in that was complicit in following authority and moving somebody sick with COVID into a care home. Yeah. Not having enough PPE. Never doing a proper cost-benefit analysis for lockdown. Where do we even begin? And people on different factions have got very different ideas about what the mistakes are. We don't really have it's not really the kind of climate where people want to admit mistakes. I think instead we'll scapegoat, and we did that a bit earlier on. So when Neil Ferguson was found to have visited the house of his lover, if that's the right way around, or she visited him, he was scapegoated. That's what I would call it. And, you know, this is an ancient biblical practice, which you will know better than me. 2 kid goats, one is sacrificed, that's the word with animals, one is sacrificed, and the other one supposedly carries the sins of the community on its back as it is cast out into the wilderness. Well, he was kind of publicly shamed for that and supposedly dropped from Sage, but I don't think he ever really went anywhere, and he's back. It was even a rubbish attempt at scapegoating, so I don't even know what that's going to look like. But people normally want to project the mistakes onto somebody and see them suffer for it and carry away the sins of everyone else. I think what's going to be difficult about this is climbing down from fear means leaving a story behind And I think that's difficult for people. So if you were very frightened of the virus and you modified your life and then that's had consequences, to admit you might have been more frightened than you need to have been, for instance, what do you do with that? Do you want to scapegoat the government? Do you want to scapegoat the media? Or does it cause so much shame you don't want to admit it?
Yeah.
I think truth as always is the answer, but it can be difficult to reach for.
Yeah.
I think the part of the issue is, of course, that the edifice that the narrative is built on now relies on so many careers are woven into those foundations, into the cement that holds it together, that it's going to be very hard for the government to step back and say, well, maybe we shouldn't have been quite so hasty, and Sweden did all right, really. Well done, Sweden. They can't do that, even though we might like.
Well, they could.
Well, yeah, but it would mean essentially the whole front bench resigning, wouldn't it? You couldn't have a political career go through that, and whole reams of civil servants and epidemiologists would have to go in order for that to sort of be acknowledged. So the edifice sort of has to hold itself up. And so that's what I worry about, is that, we're going to come out of this, we're going to have a commission sort of that looks into it and then says, well, they did their best. Let's move on quickly. And then we're sort of saddled with continuing rifts, continuing social and economic destruction for years to come. And the state institutes that could have done something about this, and I count the church as one of those, the established church as one of those, have lost their moral authority to talk on it, because they are now in that edifice as well, in their own way.
I wanted to ask you about the church, because I'm not a Christian, but I was really disappointed in the Church of England. You guys let me down. You let me down.
Yep.
What's going on? I mean, the church closed its doors at Easter. When you're reflecting on the resurrection. And I was just baffled. I interviewed a priest about it. I did a project called 2 meters. I photographed and interviewed people where I was precisely 2 meters away from them, so I could get up to this point of tension and ask them about how their lives had changed, how things were going for them. And I interviewed a priest in his empty church at Easter, and he told me, the doors are locked. And one day he came back to the church and there's someone on their knees on the steps. And really none of it actually made any sense, that people couldn't come and worship or sit and pray a little bit away from each other in church. But I thought, what is the church about? If it's not about faith saving you and eternal life, what do you stand for? Why did the church shut its doors at Easter?
Yeah. Do you want to go for that, Tom, or shall I?
Well,
Go on.
Which one of us should get fired as a result of answering this question?
Well, I've got a slightly longer career than you, Jamie, so far, so maybe it's
okay. It's a big question, Laura, and I think one of the things to say is that we both completely accept what you've just said, completely accept it, and it's not my perception of it is that it's not just the Church of England, it's all the major denominations, including, I would say, largely speaking, the Roman Catholic Church as well. But certainly all the Protestant denominations have, broadly speaking, done the same thing. It doesn't mean it's okay. Far from it. In fact, it makes it more shocking in some ways. The Church of England response has been episcopally led, so it's the bishops have really made these decisions. And I don't, I know some bishops to talk to, but I don't know any sort of intimately. I think my reading of the situation as far as the established church is concerned is that the Church of England was in a very weak position before this began. Everyone knows the church is in decline. Everyone knows its cultural influence is waning. And we've also had, like the Roman Catholic Church, we've had a massive safeguarding scandal as well, or multiple safeguarding scandals. And so I think when something came along like this, the church was in a situation where essentially, or the bishops were in a situation where essentially they decided that they had to go along with the narrative. And I think when it would have been so risky to do anything but that, it was so unacceptable, and to a degree it is still massively taboo even to question the government narrative, that it never occurred to them to question it. And I certainly I've not heard any questioning from any bishop at any point in public, not a single word. And so I mean, I think that's probably why there are obviously deeper aspects to it, aren't there? Because that touches on all sorts of deeper issues of, well, why was the response not led primarily by faith or by theology or by scripture and so on? And, you know, people can draw their own conclusions about what they think about it. But I think that's a state that the church was in at the time. Tom, do you want to add something to that?
No, I think, I mean, there's a sense in which the church has been self-selecting its leaders for a while now for conformism to the last, like, truly argumentative bishop. They went 20 years ago, you know. The idea that a bishop sort of stands up and says something different is a faint memory of the past, and yet it's a sad thing to have lost. But it's because that, you know, that does generate bad press, and you end up with conformist sort of middle managers running a religious organisation because they're the safe hands that the establishment want to run. I mean, I mean, presumably you've seen that famous scene in Yes, Prime Minister, where they talk about appointing a bishop, and effectively, you know, all that is a highly cynical scene where they talk about, oh, we don't want the one with too much faith. Oh, no. Keep them away from power. The Church of England is compromised at the highest levels because it is tucked into the government to a degree which I think people don't realise.
I think there's a confusion between the idea of a state church and an established church. You know, like a state church would just ratify everything the state, like broadly speaking, the church did in 1930s Germany. They just ratify what the state said, whereas an established church is meant to have more of a kind of prophetic voice into the culture and the nation and the government. And I think that's a conceptual confusion that we've fallen foul of as the church. But I mean, essentially, Laura, I think, you know, you're absolutely right. And there are loads of people looking at the church thinking, why on earth is there not a distinctive response? I mean, we've just been covering this letter that's been written by this group called Churches Together, which is basically encouraging literally as many people as possible to take the vaccine. And, you know, it's just basically a repetition of government propaganda.
It just takes the assumptions of the government are just taken and then just sprayed out onto the page with very little thought about that. Yeah. And you get that at all levels.
And there's no theological aspect to it. There's no sense in which our faith makes a difference, or as you say, I mean, quite rightly, just on a basic level, if you believe you're going to live forever with Christ, surely that should do something to at least, you know, reduce your fear of death or reduce your pliability. Or I think a word I've heard used a number of times, biddability. You know, I don't know, is it just biddable? Maybe is the right word, but surely it should make some difference if somebody comes along and says, "Well, you're going to die." That it should make some difference that death is, you know, death is not the end, and actually death is a kind of
we ought to be able to speak about life in its fullness as something having value as well. You know, and speak into the deprivation of lockdown. We ought to be able to speak about the lack of ability to flourish. You know, the church ought to be able to speak about the fact it can't meet. In many churches, the buildings aren't big enough to bring people in. How can a church flourish if it can't meet, if it can't know itself in the Eucharist? It's lost. The church hasn't spoken about any of these things, I think. And a number of things are particularly appalling. Like back in January, the government said churches can stay open. But was there any sort of moral support for churches that chose to stay open? No, the bishops haven't said a thing. You know, some of them privately might have said, you know, this or that, but actually saying, you know, we understand those churches that feel they can't keep going must close their doors if that's what they feel is right. But we support the right of other churches to remain open. That I know many priests who would love to have stayed open in that lockdown, but whose PCC and church wardens just were so terrified. And any support from the bishops at all, public support, would have been so helpful. But it just feels that the church has lost the lost faith in what it wants to proclaim.
It's lost a sense of identity, I think. But
the loss of faith is really interesting. Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
So I saw this really interesting image. It was Jesus above Rio, and emblazoned on him, projected in light, were the words "vaccination saves."
Yep.
And I was quite struck by this, because I thought, if you're Christian, then faith saves, belief saves.
Yeah.
And vaccination is a really useful medical intervention, but it's not a religion in itself, is it? For me, that looked as though the old religion was making way for a new religion. And again, that was epitomised for me when I saw images of old people spread out in churches waiting for their vaccinations, as though the buildings of the old religion were making way for a new one. And I don't want anyone to think in that way that I'm putting down the vaccine or people having it, or modern medical miracles, nothing like that. It was just an image that stayed with me. So churches shut their doors for a long time, but then they open, but not for the Eucharist, but for vaccination.
Yeah, it's weird.
It's like Father Jonathan Bezic said in his article in The Spectator, what was it? So vaccines good, body and blood of Christ bad. That kind of thing. Yeah.
It's
Go on, Tom. Go on.
Well, no, I think Father Jonathan Bezic said the same thing. Where does the church look like it's put its if you put your at times like this is revealed where the priorities of the church lie. And I think we have failed. I think we failed the nation. We failed certainly to speak out against fear. It says 365 times in the Bible, do not fear. It says the only thing you should fear is God. And fear of God is a slightly different idea than sort of general fear. It's a sort of, it's more linked to sort of awe and respect than it is to sort of terror. The church, by not repudiating the narrative of fear, by not saying this is a chance where the church could have spoken up and said, Christ himself says, don't fear that which can destroy the body, but fear that which can destroy the soul. And we've not heard. I mean, it's been preached it's been preached from pulpits. But we're small fry. We're two curates in the Church of England, and I know other vicars who are sympathetic, but it's not been preached at any significantly senior level. I mean, it's very sad.
We need to recover this message, and this is why we actually started. We actually put our first ever podcast out last week because I was away on holiday, and we called it The Fear of Death, and we were actually discussing a lot of these issues. But I think we both feel, and I'm sure Daniel as well, that the church needs to recover this message and start communicating it, or the Church of England's in big trouble if it carries on in the way that's going. I mean, Laura, in your book, I was really interested to ask you about the role that faith communities have played, because I was trying to find the page just then, I couldn't quite find it, but at one stage you talk about the way that specifically Muslim leaders and mosques were essentially enlisted by the government or agencies working covertly on behalf of the government. To many of us in the church, we're looking at the stuff with bishops and, like I've just said, this Churches Together letter and stuff like that. And we're thinking, what on earth is going on? Why are they talking like this? Why is Justin Welby writing an article in Christianity Today or whatever it was, which sounds like Klaus Schwab's The Great Reset? So what do you think, are they doing it as well, Laura? Do you have any take on it?
Yeah, well, there's some SPI-B papers. SPI-B is the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour. And that's a group of behavioural scientists, psychologists and social scientists that answer questions that the government poses through SAGE or through COBRA and the Cabinet Office. So the book, in a way, starts with that infamous SPI-B document that said that we were too complacent and our sense of personal threat needed to be elevated. Basically, they said that we understand the risk too well and we need to be frightened in order to follow the rules. The reason SPI-B said that was the question the government asks is, oh no, how are we going to make people follow the lockdown rules? This is unprecedented. So they answer questions that are asked of them. And there are SPI-B papers about this very matter, and they propose using community champions and faith leaders in order to encourage vaccine take-up in communities where they know that vaccine take-up might be lower, specifically Muslim communities. And so one idea was to do the vaccinations in mosques. And we also saw that in churches. Now, that could just be because churches are really nice, or cathedrals, really nice, big, convenient spaces with good ventilation and people can be spaced out. Could also be because it adds this brand of safety and respectability and credibility. But that's absolutely the intention with using mosques and with using faith leaders. Yeah. It's to encourage trust among communities in which vaccine take-up is low. Now, some people, again, will argue this is all for the greater good. So there's a net benefit to society and we shouldn't worry about it. I'm a little uncomfortable with it because I think essentially if a medical intervention is a good one, then the figures and the evidence will speak for themselves. If the government and the NHS could simply say, this is a vaccine, this is the risk benefits, this is how it will help you, we would like you to take it. If we trusted the government more, then everybody would just take it. But I feel that where our trust is weaker, they lean on other brands. So that can be faith leaders or it can be celebrities. I'm sure you've heard, certainly in other countries and possibly here, of celebrities being paid to talk about having the vaccine. And it's about leaning on other brands to encourage trust and take up. I'd say in itself it's a terrible sign about trust between government and citizens.
Yeah And there's also that thing again which comes across in your book, that it's very specifically communicated that it has to look authentic. Even if it's not authentic, it has to look authentic. So we can't have these people saying they've been paid. You give the example, I think it's of Amanda Holden, isn't it, where she puts the 2 letters AD in her tweets to indicate that it's an advert. But basically it has to look authentic. It doesn't matter whether the thing actually is authentic or not.
Yes. Now, I haven't just made that up, and I just want to say that I interpret my interviews with people, but this is all based on interviews with experts, government advisors and academics and people who are very experienced in their own fields. So this thing about it mustn't look like it's propaganda, that came from a behavioural psychologist I interviewed. And she's saying, it's really important that people take the vaccine. And she said, anti-vaxxers aren't bad people, they just don't trust it. But what we do mustn't look like it's propaganda. And I was a little taken aback because I'm thinking, oh, so it's okay to put out propaganda, it just mustn't look like it is. I think my fear with it is that ultimately that's even more damaging long term to the brand, to the government brand, and to trust between people and the government. I trust the government less than I did pre-pandemic. And I don't know what the dial would look like for the whole country. I'm not sure that I trust the public opinion polls very much either, because the way they're phrased can be really biased. But I do worry about long term what our trust is going to look like.
I happened to see an article about this the other day, and I think actually, surprisingly, trust in the government has gone up in the public as a whole, according to one opinion poll at least. But I don't trust those, so who knows?
Yeah. I think it's a bit strange to outsource public health messaging to religious leaders.
Yeah.
I think it's strange they agreed to take it up. Is the kind of, generally speaking, like if I was, say, approached by our local council to come and say how wonderful their new traffic management system was, and I would say no, actually I don't think that's appropriate, because I'm a pastor and I'm neutral about your traffic management system. I just want to see people's souls be saved. But and I'm not sure quite. Even if it saved lives, even if there was 10 bicycle deaths a year are going to be saved, I wouldn't say this is a great thing, because I just simply it's not something I have any expertise in.
It's one of those things as well where you think it might end up doing more harm than good.
To the church brand, a
bit like Hugh Grant going around trying to advocate for Remain after the Brexit vote. It's probably I don't. That's probably a bit harsh on the bishops, but you know what I mean. Laura, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the sort of the false religiosity around this thing a little bit, and to go a little bit deeper into this, because you just mentioned this a while ago, and somebody sent me, oh, by the way, we told our Patreon group that you're coming on, and they all send you their best wishes and say thank you so much for the book, and they all left brilliant comments and questions. One person sent me this definition of a cult from the International Cultic Studies Association, which define a cult as a group or movement with the following characteristics: great or excessive devotion or dedication to some person, idea, or thing, and employing unethical manipulation or coercive techniques of persuasion and control, e.g. isolation from former friends and family, debilitation, use of special methods to heighten suggestibility and subservience, powerful group pressures, information management, suspension of individuality or critical judgment, promotion of total dependency on the group, and fear of leaving it, designed to advance the goals or the group's leaders to the actual or possible detriment of members, their families, or the community. And this person comments that we've all been forced into a government cult this last year. I just wonder what your take on that is. Are we have we been? Is it a cult? Is it a religious cult that we've all been, or a quasi-religious cult that we've been inculcated into? I mean, is that a fair way to characterize it, or would you what would you say about that?
I don't think people have consciously been aware of that all the time. I don't think that Boris Johnson is a cult leader. He doesn't set himself up as that. I suspect that what it is that certain types of leaders lean into similar styles of command and control methods. This is basic human psychology. Now, I'm going to throw you religious lot in with this, because there are close parallels between cult induction, religious conversion, and political propaganda. Sorry, guys, not you, obviously, okay. Not the irreverends, but it happens.
Talking about us.
So part of my research for this book was a tremendous book called Battle for the Mind by William Sargent. As you were talking about cults, I just quickly got this quote up because it's a good one. Religious conversion techniques often approximate so closely to modern political techniques of brainwashing and thought control that each throws light on the mechanics of the others. He basically said that the priest, the politician, and the policemen have much to learn from each other, and you can lump in cult leaders in there too. So there's one chapter in the book where I talk about cults, not to say that what we've got going on here is an actual formalized cult or that Boris Johnson's a cult leader, but there's an expert on cults called Dr. Margaret Thaler Singer, and she wrote a book called Cults in Our Midst, The Continuing Fight Against the Hidden Menace. And she laid out the steps for a thought reform program that a cult would follow. And yes, there are incredible parallels. So things like the fear-mongering and the love bombing being alternated. So this may not have been conscious, but if you remember, we start with this big speech to the nation, which is very frightening on the 23rd of March. You must stay at home. Literally several days later, people are outside clapping for the NHS, which is the love bombing. And we go back and forth between this throughout. Cults also need to get hold of a lot of your time. Yeah. That's how cults work. Well, we've had the media 24/7 talking about it. And for long periods of time, we were trapped in our homes, being bombarded by that. Cults create dependency and dread and a sense of powerlessness and anxiety. And if you don't follow the rules, then you'll make everything worse. And we've certainly had those kinds of threats, like the virus won't go or lockdown can't be lifted unless you follow the rules. You also get these prophecies and delays. So, oh, well, we can't release you because some idiots broke the rule before. And you're going to get, in a cult, they might say, oh, it will be bad karma if you leave, or there'll be a natural disaster or some crappy flannel like that. And the parallel with this would be if you hug each other, or if you don't wear your mask, you're going to mess it up for everyone else. There's a lot of desensitization, so people's moral compass gets dimmed to a point that they wouldn't have recognized before. They start tolerating things that would have been unacceptable. I thought about things like the fines. You can see where that comes from, but we have these just inordinate fines now. My classic example is 2 teenagers who were fined £10,000 each in January for having a snowball fight. They organised a snowball fight. I have to say, when I saw the video of it, I'm probably not supposed to say this, but it really made me smile. I was like, oh, look at that. Young people having fun in a park. It did my heart good. And those poor kids organised it, got 10 grand fine each. I mean, I think that normally we would go, gosh, that's a bit out of order, isn't it? Isn't that a bit of a stiff fine for 2 students? But you become desensitized. Cults also have a closed system of logic, and they don't like criticism. Management is always right, you are always wrong. And questioning the government narrative has been very difficult, and actually literally almost prohibited according to Ofcom guidance. Broadcasters haven't been able to broadcast information which would be damaging to public health information. So there are lots of examples of where what's been happening has been like a cult. So it's a fair comparison.
I've got a question about that last one. So one of the notable things, it was quite funny, I think 2 days ago, the BBC reported on 70 people protesting outside a Cardiff, the Cardiff town office or something, and yet the BBC have yet to produce a full report on the enormous sort of protest marches in the last 3 months. You know, they're simply ignoring it. But not just the BBC, all of the press seem to be ignoring the fact that we've got these huge uprisings of support for the anti-lockdown cause, so to speak, or the no vaccine passports, or whatever. You know, there are lots of different causes sort of bolted into one, but generally speaking, the sort of skeptical side. I mean, is that all because of Ofcom, or is there now just such a sort of blinkered groupthink going on in our press that they simply can't break out of this way of thinking? Do you know?
I'm not really. I wish I did know, because I've really tried to get to the bottom of that. There's a chapter on media in the book. I suspect it's multifactorial. There's Ofcom, but Ofcom wouldn't explain why newspapers report on the protests the way they do. There's also partiality, there's editor and proprietor bias, there's informal relationships between journalists and people in the cabinet, there's wanting to maintain favoured relationships and privileged information. They might be being told, you've got to do the right thing, come on guys, we can't let those crazy batshit anti-lockdown, anti-vaxxers get reported on. And that's a total mischaracterization of the protests as well. Maybe they've got D-notices waving above their heads from on high, and it's considered to be against the national security to report on the protests. I'm not sure, but I have been on a few in order to report on them myself. And I honestly didn't really know what to make of the coverage, because when I went to the one that was huge, now I'm terrible with numbers, but it can't have been less than 50,000 people. It was massive. Yeah. And yet the BBC reported that a few thousand people were there. I thought, well, crikey, I'm not really sure what to make of that. Does this mean I have to fact check front page news on everything in the future? Can I believe the BBC News on anything? If I was there and I know that's wrong, what does that mean? And there are some of the kind of anti-vaxxers you'd expect at these protests. And when I use that term, I don't wish to denigrate them. I think everyone's actually entitled to their own beliefs, but that's the kind of the handy term, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And, you know, crusty hippies waving sage around and smudging sage in the air. And, you know, there's all sorts. It's a mixed bag, but most of the protest signs are about restoring freedom or being against vaccine certificates, which is different to being against vaccines. Yeah. And I think the protests were a really broad church, and they're a broad church because they're genuinely grassroots. They're not very coordinated. There are a lot of people there, and there's a general swell of feeling which is about being against lockdown and wanting restrictions eased and not wanting tighter controls like vaccine certificates. But it's not an anti-vax protest, and certainly not of a few thousand people.
Yeah, it's strange. I mean, I'm hoping I might be able to go to the 26th of June one, especially if we're not unlocked, because I think that could be another big one. But I think some people who I know who went to one wildly they had a great time. For one thing, they said it was, you know, ethnically diverse, socially diverse, much more so than other protests. I don't think was it Jon Snow, the presenter who got in trouble for calling the Brexit protests a sea of whiteness or something. I don't think you could make that accusation. You know, they are, I've been told by people who I trust that they are very diverse, very animated, friendly, and huge. You know, bigger protests, and yet there's nothing yet. And 70 people go down to protest in Cardiff against the Palestinian state, Israeli state, and the BBC reports on that. It's weird. It's very strange. It's troubling. I think I share your trouble. Yeah.
Laura, we want to respect your time and finish up in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to just finish with a question that a number of people asked from our Patreon community. I think lots of people are struggling with a similar thing, which is that they feel disconnected from family and friends because of differences over this. And in different ways, people are asking the question, what can we do in order to help others? So one person, Carl, for example, says, I'd like to hear about Laura's view on how an individual can sit balanced in the middle of all of this to find compassion for both sides. On one side, people have been coerced to fear a virus. On the other side, people fear the growing tyranny. Remaining still and sovereign in this is a parting of the Red Sea. Very nice image. But do you have any sort of, I think your book is a great resource, by the way. I honestly think this is the most important book that's been written about the pandemic. Probably the most important book overall that's been written in the last 18 months, I would say. It's such an important book, and it's so brilliant. And I think it's a fantastic resource. But do you personally have any sort of words of wisdom for, bringing about reconciliation, but also for helping people to sort of wake up from the, from the narrative and to start sort of thinking a bit more clearly about all of this?
Well, I'm honoured to be asked. Thank you. And thank you for being so kind about the book. I really did write it in service to people. And I think that this has been a time when a lot of people have discovered more faith, because it's been such a difficult time. I wrote it from a long, dark night of the soul. And it was not always fun and easy. I've got to say, researching fear and the impacts on people and uncovering this Pandora's box of propaganda was difficult. It wasn't fun, but I just felt it was an important thing. And I thought, I'm so unhappy with the direction of travel in society that I will risk everything to do it. Yeah. And so if it's helping people, that's all I wanted. And so it's really good to know that. But Laura in real life isn't necessarily as wise as she might seem in her book. So I've definitely experienced division with people, and it's been really hard. Yeah. So I don't want to name names in case people listen, but people really close to me I have felt a real chasm with during this. I think some of that can be just like shedding friendships that don't fit anymore, and that's okay. I have made so many good friends in the last year, because I think I've worked out for myself a lot what my values are, what I stand for, and what's important. And I won't be deterred from having the highest moral standards and being compassionate and wanting an open society and being non-judgmental. But that hasn't fed through into all my closest relationships. I have felt that division where our fears have been completely different, and I actually don't know the answer. I think it's that we have to listen to each other, and we have to accept that we feel differently. We just have to accept it and be with it. And yet I'm not actually quite ready to, because I feel hurt. I still feel hurt that other people close to me, their values were so different. I think it's going to be a really difficult one to move past. I think this is Brexit with bells on. I never had a Brexit moment with anybody. I've always been quite apolitical. I've voted for 3 different parties so far, and I couldn't have got that worked up about anything. But this is a really big one. And I think that what people think the important priorities are so different. It makes it different. It's difficult to reconcile, because for some people it's all about a virus and not being ill or dying and saving other people's lives and putting other people's lives first and protecting them. And for others, it's about a completely different imagining of society. What do we want society to look like? Yeah. It's hard. I think it's going to take time, but we have to hear each other's fears. The problem is that the people say who would like restrictions to continue want to do that for everybody and not just themselves. Yeah. There's a lot of intolerance around. That makes it difficult. But no, I've fallen out with people myself. Not quite fallen out with, but become less close to. Yeah. And I don't have a personal answer to offer yet, unfortunately. But I am aware of it and I'm working on it. I know it's something I need to do. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think all of that's brilliant, Laura. I think what you say, especially about hearing each other's fears, I think that's really, really important. And I wonder whether,
the church might have a role to play in sort of facilitating almost, sort of open dialogues between people of different views on this, just to sort of hear, just to sort of listen, have a sort of almost a listening event or something like that. Perhaps, I don't know really. But Laura.
I love that idea. Please.
Well,
yes.
Maybe you could come and be one of the speakers. That would be fantastic.
I just think it's a wonderful idea. That's exactly what we need to do.
Yeah.
Because we all have to live on this earth together. We all have to find accommodation with each other. There is just one society.
Yeah, that's true.
I think, if I may add, I think what part of the problem here is that value judgments are form sort of, the science is not actually as doesn't actually tell us anything. What tells us things is what we value. And it's perfectly all right in some senses to value your health above your liberty, and for another person to value their liberty above their health. And but with both, the judgments are personal. They've been skewed by propaganda and by fear, which is where the divisions come in. They tend to those fear creates those entrenchments into those. So one person says they stop being able to see that those are two different value judgments, and instead start seeing them as opposing kind of people coming at each other, and it's really hard to get out of that. We need to start by acknowledging, I guess, that the core of everyone's idea is not, we don't have evil people who want to drop the lockdown and kill millions of frail elderly, and we don't have, people who want to see everyone locked up until death goes away. But we need to kind of meet in the middle of saying, actually, we all value humanity. We're just trying to value it in different ways, and that's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard.
Yeah, and I think you've got very thorny times ahead in the church too, because we now have COVID passports at stadia. What's next? Churches? That's going to be a really tricky one, isn't it, for the church to handle?
Yeah, it is. I don't know.
Not in my name.
Yeah. Did you see our vaccine passport letter, Laura? It was in. We did get quite a lot of coverage in the mainstream media. Ironically, because we've stopped engaging with the mainstream media, but yeah, so we wrote an open letter which was signed by, I think it was about 1,600 Christian leaders and ministers in the end, saying that.
Yes, I did see it.
We did see it. Oh, good.
Yeah. I found it so encouraging and heartening.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So there are definitely people out there who feel strongly about this, but I think one of the problems is everyone's sort of so isolated and atomized that it's a kind of divide and conquer type thing, isn't it? But I think this thing about vaccine passports in church, I think it's so clear for so many people how wrong it would be that would be. I think that would be something that would generate an awful lot of opposition. And so maybe that might end up being a kind of Rubicon moment. I don't really know. But we will see. Laura, I think I can hear your dog in the background.
I'm so sorry.
Absolutely fine, but we wouldn't want to deprive your dog of your attention for much longer. I know what needy dogs are like. I've got a spaniel myself, and he's incredibly needy. But Laura, I just want to say it's been such an honor having you on the podcast. It's been fantastic, and thank you so much for coming on and sharing your thoughts with us. And thanks again for your book, which is absolutely brilliant. It's a work of real quality. It's substantive, it's well researched, it's deep, but it's written in a style which is so accessible, and anyone could read it and understand it. And I think that combination is a really winning combination. It's the thing that makes it such a useful resource in this dialogue. So congratulations on the book. You deserve all the plaudits and all the good sales you're getting, and I hope you're very pleased with it.
I am. Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for having me. I've been really excited about it. Thanks for having me today.
Oh, yeah, well, it's fantastic. It's been fantastic, Laura. And I think we'll sign off now, shall we, Tom? Just to people listening, if you'd like to join our Patreon community, you can do it for a very, very low price of £3 a month, patreon.com/irreverend to support the podcast and join our online community. But that's it for this time. Tom, do you want to say a quick prayer or a blessing for us?
Of course, yeah. So thank you, Lord, for bringing us together today to discuss all these things. We pray that your light and truth may cut through fear and darkness in this world. Pray for all those who are worried, who are fearful, who are isolated. And we pray for reconciliation of this divided nation and a blessing on all people who are listening to this podcast. Amen.
Amen. Thanks so much, Tom. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.